Hi everyone, and welcome to the garden at the end of December. It's actually 62 today after we had, I think it got down to -9 around our home. I think I shot some footage and posted on Instagram the day it got so cold, and it was -7 by the time I got up and shot the footage. But I wanted to take you around and show you a few things in the garden because I added some plants that are only hardy to zone 6 in my garden this year, and they are evergreen typically in most zones, sometimes semi-evergreen in my zone, but surprisingly all of them have kept their leaves really well despite that cold we had, and they're still holding on to them about a week later. So I'll walk you around and show you some things that I'm seeing in the garden. It's kind of interesting to be able to get out here this time of the season and take a walk around the garden and inspect and see if we have any damage. I am seeing still a little bit of rabbit damage. I did cover up this beautyberry, but you can see the bunny damage or something here where they just chopped it off. If I hadn't have covered it up, it would have been much worse, I'm sure. I'm going to be moving this beautyberry. I'm not sure where, but I'm getting a Centara blue lilac. Actually, you can see evidence of the bunny right there. And right there. So lots of bunnies in the garden in winter, but I'm going to be getting a Centara blue lilac and probably replacing it right here. It'll get pretty large, but I think it'll look nice because these trees end right here, and these only get about 4 foot wide, so they're going to come out to about here, maybe 6 foot wide, so here. And then this will fill this space, and we'll have some really beautiful lilac blooms right here next to the pergola and the patio in spring. Right here is a dogwood. I think this one's called Arctic Sun. It's grown a little weird, but you can see how beautiful these stems are, orange and red here. That's why I picked this variety. So this one will also grow up in this space and be really beautiful in a few years. I just happened to get those plants really small. I believe I got them from Great Garden Plants, and they've just taken a little bit to settle in, as some of those things do in our heavy clay soil. Looking around the rest of the garden, stuff is looking pretty good. I've still got some winterberry hollies holding on to their berries, which is really nice after that freeze. They're a little darker than they were. I'll show those to you right quick. So they may not have much longer left before they kind of fall off, but they're still looking really nice here. I really love this variety. I think this is called Berry Poppins, potentially. It's supposed to be a smaller variety, and it's kind of tucked here under this Rising Sun redbud, or it will be eventually as this Rising Sun gets bigger, but I think it'll be really beautiful in the space. This is a Tampa Norway spruce, and it does not look, I moved it back here to kind of give it a second chance, and it looks really, really horrible after our freeze. So it lost a ton of leaves. I'll give that an opportunity to see if it puts on any growth in the spring, and then I'm going to remove it. It had already died back and lost a bunch of needles in the back there. This was just an opportunity to try and save it, and it doesn't look like it's going to recover very well. So that'll be something that we have to take out and replace with probably another evergreen. These are golden ticket privet, which tend to be semi-evergreen around here. Last year they were their first year planted, but this year they did not enjoy at all this cold spell we got. So they have all turned brown, and I imagine it will completely defoliate. There's some fresh growth down here at the bottom that's kind of a different color. Kind of interesting. It's really dark. I don't imagine these will hang on, though. We'll see. There's a lot of dead in there. The shrubs themselves should come back perfectly fine, but sometimes they're semi-evergreen here, and I just don't think they're going to be semi-evergreen this year. One thing I continue to be increasingly impressed with are the Nandinas. So Nandinas are hardy to zone 6. I'm of course in zone 6, but I've had some viewers complain in zone 6 that they have not overwintered for them and they have died over winter. Well, mine, even though it got to -9, which our zone hardiness is -10, mine are still looking really good. I have one of the Obsession up here I'll show you that doesn't look as great as the other one on the other side, but it didn't look as good when I planted it anyway. It was kind of struggling. It was a Home Depot plant that they had kind of neglected. But this blush pink one is still just a really good contender in the garden. Now, it doesn't look as it did the week before. You can see back here where we got some really heavy winds. It was just a little bit too cold for it, and some of those leaves aren't going to make it. But these right here still look really good. And so if they made it through that, I think these will probably be mostly evergreen in my zone. We'll have to see. This is their first year, so it's going to be the roughest year on them in the garden. Still really impressed with this variety. I think it's one of my favorite Nandinas, and it stays really small. It's non-invasive like a lot of older Nandinas are, and it's just a beautiful pop of color both in the summer, spring, and over winter with this nice red foliage. Now this Nandina up here next to the staircase that I planted looks a little more rough, but it's still pretty green and it's got all its leaves. And actually this looks like some newer growth right here that's coming out that may have just got a little too cold and more damaged than the rest of it, but you can see how healthy it looks under there. Now this side, the Obsession Nandina, is much more red. It looks almost like that blush pink Nandina, but this is brand new growth on it in the middle of winter. You can see how beautiful that's looking, and this is really what I wanted in this space. Previously, you know, I had some Baptisia here and they were just getting too large too quickly, and in my experience Baptisia is really difficult to plant under. The reason being, the reason it's not going to work great in my yard, I kind of moved them back somewhere else where I can cut on them for blooms and foliage. They grow very upright in the spring. I tend to want to underplant stuff, so you can't underplant them because as the season progresses, they just get wider and wider and start falling down and touching the ground. So you have to leave that entire 3 to 5 foot area around the plant clear all season. So in spring, it looks really empty because the plant's really upright. But if you were to plant anything under it, it wouldn't get any sunlight by probably July. And so I like to underplant, and so they're not going to be a good choice in my garden. I think if you had a really nice bank and you needed some interesting like texture that would catch some breeze, that'd be really good in mass. But for a single specimen, since I like to plant pretty closely, Baptisia is not working out great for me in my garden. But they're still beautiful and I love them, so I have some to cut on. I just don't want to dedicate that space when I have multiple things I could plant all in that space that give me, you know, more interest, like these over winter, provide some color, or some other aspect of allowing multiple plants to commingle rather than one taking up a big space. Now, Proudberry Coralberry has had it, and it would be a contender to go ahead and cut down if we continue to have some okay weather in January where I can get out here. You just cut these down 6 to 12 inches to the ground. You can actually see in here where I cut it down last year, and they grow right back to the size they were. Really beautiful, but these berries just turn to mush really quickly for me. Here in my little woodland space where we've got some phlox here on the ground that kind of covers and is semi-evergreen, we got a little bit of hellebore action starting on some of these tiny hellebores that I planted. So we'll be having some hellebore blooms in the coming month, I believe, which will be really exciting. I just stuck random hellebores that I got on discount. They were plugs pretty much, but I've tucked them randomly around here behind the willow or under the willow, and then around the landscape up front as well, just to have some interesting stuff here and there blooming really early. I've also tucked some random bulbs throughout here under the willow. Those are going to be primarily daffodils, so we'll have to keep an eye on that daffodil foliage as we head more into later winter and spring. I'm not seeing any signs right now of anything coming up, but those were just planted at the end of October, early November. I've had people ask several times about the Mondo grass pathway that I planted here. We still got lots of Mondo grass. If you go back and watch that video, you know I divided these pretty tiny, and it took them kind of a year to settle in. I think they struggled because they were next to these rocks, which made them a little bit colder and then a little bit hotter in summer when we were having less rain some parts of the year. But they're filling in kind of nicely and clumping up a little more. So I've got more in this area, and I kind of ran out before I got down there. So as this fills in, or I may be able to find some more, I can divide it and spread it to these other cracks back here as well. One thing that did not tend to fare very well with that super cold weather is the brass buckle ilexes you see behind me. They are a tiny evergreen shrub. They're basically a holly, but a holly that does not have like a spiky leaf. But they are beautiful because the more sun they catch, they turn really yellow. And last year they were yellow all season, but this year with that really cool weather we got, we did have some browning here at the very top. But you can see here is typically what they would normally be, is this bright yellow in this area. A little bit of damage there, but it should come back okay. Now is a great time if you're concerned about a specific plant after that really incredible freeze and storm that came through. Specifically a woody plant like this hibiscus rose of Sharon here. You can scratch the bark very lightly with your thumbnail, not super deep, but you just want to go down just a little bit. And if you can see green, it's still alive. If you see brown or it's really tough to get through, that's a potential indicator that at least that branch is dead. The whole trunk may not be dead, but that branch may be something you have to cut off in the spring. And if you do find brown, you might want to check another branch on the tree or go further down on the trunk to make sure there's some green. Of course, don't do a lot of damage because it is winter, and so you don't want to be doing a ton of that, but just a tiny little section, just a, smaller than your pinky nail, a little scratch off to see if there's any green. Could be really beneficial to determine whether it's something you might need to watch a little carefully in spring or something you need to prepare to replace. You can see some of these sedums are really mushy after that freeze, but we've got some new baby growth in here. This is the back and black variety, so the seed heads are pretty in fall and winter, but late winter, early spring, I'll come through and cut those down to the ground. That way we can have all this beautiful new growth come up. Really excited about this variety this year. These were planted bare root last year, so they were really tiny, but I think giving them a year to clump up is going to be a really beautiful mass of black foliage here. And then the blooms are kind of pink to red, and so it's a really interesting contrast. A nice front of the border plant in an area. This area doesn't stay, super moist. It does have sprinkler on it. I have had issues with some sedums in my garden because I think they get a little too much water in my clay soil, but I'm hoping this variety will do okay for me. Seeing a lot of buds on other plants like this groundhug aronia right here. This is going to be really beautiful in spring when it leaves out, I think. One plant I have, one Nandina specifically, that did not fare as well is the lemon lime variety. You can see under here this doesn't look too bad, but this one received doesn't look like as bad a damage. I have one that I planted a little later in the season. I picked them up at the same time, but the other one just didn't get in the ground as early, and it is looking much worse. One thing that's still looking incredible is this little rascal holly from Monrovia that I got earlier this year. I will maybe adding a little more of these to my garden. I just think the color is really fantastic, especially this time of year. It turns almost black, but you can still see a little yellow, green, and red in there. It's just a really, really interesting shrub, and it stays small. It is pokey, but it's not terribly pokey that it's going to damage, or hurt your hands. But a nice hedge of these somewhere would be really beautiful. It'll be interesting to see how this hydrangea from Monrovia, this is one of the ones I picked up at Lowe's earlier this year on discount, Seaside Serenade Newport, fares. You can see the buds on here. It is a reblooming macrophylla, but the buds don't look super healthy after that really cold freeze we have. In fact, this one right here looks completely dead. So that'll be interesting to see if this one reblooms early spring or not. It's not looking great. I don't want to sacrifice any of these buds. They don't feel like super dry or delicate, except these tip ones here. But we'll just have to see if we get any blooms of it early spring. If not, we'll test its reblooming capabilities come later summer or earlier summer. Some of the other hydrangeas, like this ruby slippers, actually look pretty good. The buds are much softer than that macrophylla, which is a good indicator. It's even got some leaves hanging on over winter here. And this is Fairy Trail Bride, and it's looking pretty rough too. And so it's a new variety of hydrangea that was discovered recently or brought to market recently, and don't have great hopes for it in our zone. So Fairy Trail Bride was originally announced last year in 2021. I managed to get my hands on it and got it planted in a container, and then I moved it out into the landscape late fall. And it was a smaller shrub when I got it last year, and it did not make it through winter. It was originally announced as a Zone 7 plant. They lowered that down to Zone 6, but the thing is it doesn't bloom on new wood. And so if the buds die, that's all the blooms that it's probably going to have for the season. So this is one that I might end up giving to one of my more southern friends or family if I don't get any blooms off of it this spring. Because what's the point in having a hydrangea if you can't get blooms from it? Now this is the other Nandina I wanted to show you that looks much worse. So it's the lemon lime variety that I mentioned, and it is looking much worse. I think it'll be okay. It just looks heavily damaged from that freeze we had. There's more of these browner looking leaves, and it's of course not as vivid. We're of course not having a whole lot of sunlight either here in Ohio. It's very gray, and it probably will be for the next couple months, but this one definitely took more damage than the one on the side of the house. You can see here on the hellebores that are much more established that we're getting some blooms pushing. This is one of the earliest times I think I've seen my hellebore start pushing blooms, but the weather other than this really cold spell we had has been really mild for December, and so this is going to be really interesting. These may bloom in January, which is a little earlier than usual. Also getting some growth on this lungwort, which I love because it blooms super early spring, and some beautiful purple pink blooms on there. One thing that's planted in this bed that will be redesigned in spring, you know, all of this stuff is going to come out and this will be moved somewhere else. This is gold dust 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 that I picked up from 𝗟𝗏𝗄𝗄𝗄 earlier this year. Gold dust 𝗟𝗟𝗏𝗂𝗏 apparently is a zone 7 plant, but 𝗟𝗏𝗄𝗄𝗄𝗃 carries it and guarantees it in our zone because they say it dies back to the ground. Now, before this storm we had come through, even though it had been cold, the leaves still looked pretty good, like those here. After that storm, these are complete goners, and so even the stems, I think, have died back, at least to the tips here. You can see how brown those are. It's a little more green here. So that's what they said is more typical in our zone. It will die back to the ground, especially if we get really cold like we did now. But they say it's pretty hardy here, so we're going to move this somewhere else in spring and see how it does. One last thing I want to show you is the kaleidoscope Abelia. So we talked about a lot of plants that are marginally hardy here or just hardy to zone 6. And the kaleidoscope Abelia was looking really beautiful. I posted some photos and video on Instagram a couple weeks ago, right before this freeze came through, and it was looking really nice. Now, as this freeze came through, the leaves are much more brown, so I don't know if those will fall off. There's still some greener ones at the base that were a little more protected, and I'll show you that right now. But if we traditionally didn't get that cold, and we haven't, this is the coldest it's gotten since I've lived here. I think it's got that cold the first year I was here, at least -3. But since I've been up here almost 6 years, we've not reached temperatures as cold as it got last week. And so I was hoping that we would be moving kind of up a zone because it's been several years, but that specific freeze might have changed that. And now that we've had that weather, I know I don't want to push putting any plants in my garden that might be a zone 7. Of course, if it's cold only for a little bit, like it was there just for a couple days, you might be able to push it a little more, but I'm not comfortable spending more money on a plant, at least a larger plant. It would be nice to trial a smaller one. Specifically, 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 is something that I would really love to have in zone 6, but they're typically hardy to only zone 7. But that might be something that I can tuck around somewhere, and if it doesn't get that cold that often, or for an extended length of time, might survive here in zone 6 Southwest Ohio. Let's take a look at that Abelia right quick. So you can see here it's much brown. I'll put some video up of what this looked like just 2 weeks ago. The leaves are also kind of mushy, so I think these are probably not gonna make it and it will defoliate. Down here, there's much more green, but before these, they were a beautiful orange color. So this is a little protected. There's this hydrangea here. It's kind of tucked back in the back here, but it's been a really nice plant that I added to my garden early summer, and I've really enjoyed the color that it's put on. So I think it'll do really good here. We'll just have to see how it performs after this really cold weather, but still looking healthy, at least at the base. So I know it's not dead. We'll just have to give it a chance to recover in spring and see if it comes back with a vengeance, which, since it's hardy in our zone, it probably will. But you can always never be sure with things that are just hardy in your zone. I should probably check on my dahlias, but I'm not going to do that for several reasons. One, I'm still wanting to redo this vegetable garden space, so if they don't make it, that'll be a little less stress for me. Two, if I look now and they didn't make it, Dahlia buying season's coming up at the beginning of January. If it's not already launched at some stores online anyway. And so I want to save my money that I would typically spend on dahlias. I didn't buy any this past year, but the year before I spent quite a lot, and I'd rather put that money towards other projects and then reinvest maybe in dahlias next year after I have a better place set up for them and I get the vegetable garden space set up more appropriately. I hope you enjoyed this mini winter garden tour and to see some of these marginally hardy or just hardy plants and how they're performing. I'm really happy about how everything's looking, specifically how cold and windy the weather was. The wind can be just as damaging as the cold in a lot of cases, and we had really heavy wind along with the -9-degree temperatures. And so to see things still performing really well is really good, really exciting for spring. Now we just start and continue with our planning for all the projects that I want to do this coming year and preparing to see bulbs and hellebores. Thank you guys for joining me in the garden today. And remember, in a world full of hate, be a light. Take care, everyone. Bye.